While you settle down, the format is I'm going to ask each of these panelists to take 7 to 10 minutes to lay out the sort of outline of what they expect from 2024. Then I'm going to ask them 1 or 2 questions, and then a little twist where I'm going to ask each of them to pick one of their co-panelists and ask a question. And I assume that those questions will be much more informed than anything I can ask. And then finally, I will come to you in the audience for your questions. We have an hour and a half in total, so plenty of time for sort of a rich and deep conversation. So, Paul, I'm going to start with you to lay out the sort of overall economic picture of what you expect 2024 will bring for the region, and then we'll follow up after that.
Thank you very much, Bobby, and a great pleasure to be here at the Asia Society again as well. So I know we're supposed to look forward to 2024, but it's a little bit difficult to do that without looking a little bit back. And I think as an economist looking at the US economy, Asian economies, the global economy, it's been another one of these sort of nobody could expect would happen roller coaster, 4 years or so, 3 years going into 4 now. And, economists like to talk in terms of shocks to the economy. And we've had a series of 3 or 4 shocks. The first one, of course, is COVID, which at the time, in the first half of 2020, it's kind of easy to forget now, was the biggest negative shock to economic activity that the modern world, if not the world, has ever recorded. Much bigger than the financial crisis. Worse than the Great Depression in terms of its time compression. A couple of months, unemployment went up 11 percentage points in the US. So we had COVID. Governments and central banks reacted as you kind of would hope and expect them to react, which is, particularly under the circumstances, that it was largely, not completely, governments that sort of forced the shutdown in economic activity. So they were kind of on the hook for this. You got a lot of fiscal stimulus and then monetary stimulus coming in. You can't really fault the governments for not being aggressive enough in putting money in people's pockets in these very dire times, tiding them through that period. And then, of course, what happened next, economists like myself and others should have seen this coming better than we did. There are a few who can claim victory. Larry Summers at Harvard Kennedy School is probably one of them, which is we had this inflation shock in 2021, which continued into 2022. Inflation going to 8%, 9%, depending on which measure you looked at here in the US. That's not supposed to happen. Inflation is supposed to be kept around 2%. So what happens next? Again, fairly predictable. Central banks started hiking interest rates. As we speak, we're in the middle of a 2-day FOMC meeting, last meeting for the Federal Reserve for the year. They'll probably keep interest rates on hold, but they've taken their federal funds rate from 0 to 25 basis points as of March just last year, 2022, now to 5.25% to 5.5%. So 522 basis points, 5.25 percentage points, if you like, of interest rate tightening in the US. And of course, we've seen the same thing in the ECB has done the same in the Eurozone. I've seen the same thing, obviously, in Australia, Reserve Bank of Australia, the UK. So every central bank, pretty much in the developed world, there's one exception, Japan, has had to slam the foot on the monetary brakes, raise interest rates, and try to slow economic activity down. So that brings me to the big question for 2024, Bobby, for these main developed world economies, which is, is there going to be a recession as a result of all of this monetary tightening? And there are some major economists out there, I think Citi still are forecasting a recession in the US in the first half of next year. And that's the distinct kind of possibility that there could be a recession. Now, what is a recession? Recession, people say, well, that's 2 quarters of negative real GDP growth. Here in the US, it's actually slightly more sophisticated than that. There is a committee of wise men and women that meet and say, yes, there was a recession. That usually happens after the event. They look at a number of indicators, employment, GDP, other indicators of economic activity. But, so far, the US in particular, Europe as well, UK has escaped a recession, which many people thought would happen this year, because the Fed started tightening March 2022, Bank of England started tightening around about then, ECB a little bit later. So we've had a year and a half of monetary policy tightening. So far, no recession. If we look at the US in particular, it's weathered this third shock. So COVID, the first shock, inflation, the second shock, interest rate tightening, the third shock. Of course, you could throw in the fourth shock of the Ukraine war, which certainly fed into a little bit of inflation, but inflation was already pretty much off to the races by the time that happened. And so, the big question now is the fourth shock some kind of recession? I think the betting now, and when economists do their forecasts, they're very reluctant to pencil in a recession. One reason is kind of doesn't look very good, but there's also a logic that if everybody's expecting a recession, particularly if the central banks are forecasting a recession, well, the recession probably won't happen because the job of the central bank is to make sure recessions don't happen. So the more that everybody says, oh, there's a recession's coming, typically that's when you don't get a recession. When you get a recession is more likely to be when people are not expecting it and some new shock hits the economy. So, I wouldn't mind betting that the US, at least, is able to skirt this situation, particularly given the strength and the resilience of the economy. But if we do get a recession in 2024, and then people also start to think about the political cycle with the elections in November, although I don't think that factors really too directly into the Federal Reserve's thinking. But if we do get a recession, it's more than likely going to be, more of an adjustment recession. That is, we've had this turbulence, we've had the monetary tightening, the economy's been surprisingly strong, and the monetary tightening kind of catches up with the economy. And you get a bit of a slowdown, a bit of a pause, a bit of a contraction for a couple of quarters, and then it picks up again. That's probably one of the two likely scenarios. The other one is we sort of skirt it altogether. I'd like to pivot to Japan, but maybe we'll just hold that off. And
yeah, we could come back to that. Sydney, Southeast Asia, the sort of, from this distance, it looks like the big event is the election in Indonesia. And you spend a lot of time in Jakarta, of course. What are you looking at as possibilities for 2024 about that election and other developments in your region?
Sure, thank you for that. Well, the first presidential debate was last night in Jakarta. There are 3 candidates running in the election, which is scheduled for February 14th. And in the debate, one candidate, the former governor of Central Java, was bland and vacuous, and he probably has very little chance of winning. The second candidate, the former governor of Jakarta, was sharp, focused, in command of detail and facts, and he also has very little chance of winning. The third candidate looked old and tired, and he has the best chance of securing victory. His name is Prabowo Subianto, and he's ahead in the polls by almost 20 points. So this was cemented after he took as his running mate the son of the current president, Jokowi. So you can expect in a Prabowo presidency continuity, and that is continuity in the family, continuity in the elite, continuity in corruption, and continuity in democratic decline. In addition, one of the major aspects of the Jokowi presidency has been his reliance on China as an economic partner. That certainly will continue in a Prabowo presidency, and it focuses on the Belt and Road Initiative, which Indonesia has taken great advantage of. If you look, however, at China's role in 2 other places in Southeast Asia, Myanmar and the Philippines, it's not a very pretty picture. In the Philippines, there's been a marked turn toward the United States and the West after Duterte stepped down and he was succeeded in another case of family continuity by the son of former dictator Ferdinand Marcos. Marcos has turned out to be much more pro-American and much less authoritarian inclined than some people feared. On the other hand, there has been this decision to implement an enhanced defense agreement with the Philippines and the U.S., which will give the United States access to 9 bases in the Philippines, military bases, including those which are closest to Taiwan in northern Luzon. So U.S. hostility, U.S.-China hostility is increasing with the Philippines as a kind of focal point at a time when clashes in the South China Sea between the Philippine Navy and the Chinese Navy/Coast Guard are increasing. In Myanmar, we have a civil war that's not getting any better, but we also have China moving into Myanmar in a major security role because it has finally decided that the hapless military junta responsible for the coup in February 2021 is not capable of defending Chinese interests or keeping its key trade routes open along the Myanmar-China border. So on October 27th, we saw a de facto alliance between China and some ethnically Chinese armed groups that are fighting against the government basically take over 150 almost, but well over 100 police posts along the border in a way that basically underlined to the Chinese that it was the ethnic armed groups and not the military junta that was in the best position to defend Chinese interests. So this has major implications for both the survival of the junta, the possibility that the Chinese will increasingly see the anti-junta forces as an ally, but that will also underscore how unimportant the U.S. role has been in Myanmar and how little it can compete effectively with China to play a role there. The one other thing I would say about returning to the Philippines for a moment is that we're also going to have major elections in 2025 in Muslim Mindanao. And these are likely, unfortunately, to be violent. They are likely to lead to the removal or the loss by the MILF, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, of its control over the government in the new Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, abbreviated BARM, and the return in a major way of all those traditional family clans that have been in control of Mindanao and the Sulu Archipelago from time immemorial. So I think look for violence, but with the possibility that some disillusioned members of the MILF could move over into more militant groups.
Thanks, Adi. Bates? Yep. China, of course, is the 800-pound panda. Does that work in the room?
Vicious, yeah.
And will have what happens in China will have a major bearing on the region, but the rest of the world, of course. We're watching to see how the politics in Beijing plays out, as well as how far these headwinds on the economy will continue to slow things down there. What are you expecting to see? What should we be alarmed about? And is there room for hope?
Well, thanks, Bobby, and thanks for the opportunity to be here this evening. Yeah, I just wanted to maybe tick off on 4 broad baskets, issue areas I'm going to be watching for China in 2024. And the first one is I think we should talk about the economy. I don't think any analyst out there has high expectations of a return to, the past. If anything, I think the new normal for the Chinese economy, still respectable for an economy that's $20 trillion, growing at 2 or 3% means it's growing, the size of Switzerland or another major economy every year. So it's not as if it's going backward, or we should expect negative growth for China, but it just simply is going to be more sluggish, I think. And we're all waiting to see whether or not Xi Jinping and people around him, hopefully some of the more moderate, a little bit more technocratic economic specialists might be able to prevail over Xi's thinking and try to introduce some forms of reform. But I don't think we should hold our breath on that. One interesting indicator, something to look for in 2024, is whether there will even be a third plenum. As you know, the third plenum is a meeting of the party leadership. Traditionally, the third plenum is one that tackles questions of economic reform. Usually that meeting convenes in October or November, but this year it has not happened. We don't know when it's going to happen. That may be an indication that there's still some indecision about just what exactly the third plenum is going to deliver in terms of its outcomes. So I think we should not expect major new growth for China economically, and a continuation, I guess, of this security over growth paradigm that Xi has introduced in recent years. Alongside that, though, and also contributing to some of this economic malaise or sluggishness, I would foresee continuation of this sort of societal angst, societal mistrust and uncertainty that emerged a year ago, very strongly, a year ago, but particularly coming out of the harsh lockdown period and then the overly rapid lifting of those lockdowns and the subsequent widespread death to persons in China who would have been either immunocompromised or elderly, probably numbering around 1 million people in 2023. But kind of coming out of that lockdown period and a sort of uncertainty about the future direction of the economic policy, I think that's really worn away at some of the societal trust. In a way, the sort of the age-old bargain, the political bargain that the Communist Party established with the people of China, that trust us to deliver a better day tomorrow. Let us be in power, and we will let you prosper economically. That bargain has been severely, severely damaged. And the degree to which that bargain, Bobby, is the foundation upon which the party rests its mandate and its ability ultimately to remain in power has also been eroded. I'm not predicting a collapse of the party. That would certainly be a black swan event, and I would not predict it. But I think the party is being tested pretty harshly. And I think the Chinese people today are far less enamored, far less supportive, I think, far less confident that the party knows what it's doing when it comes to maintaining especially economic growth and building up trust between the party and the people. So I'm going to be watching that. I don't suspect we'll see any widespread demonstrations of the sort we saw a year ago, the white paper protests. But nevertheless, I think there's an underlying sort of angst and eroding trust within the Chinese society, which is going to continue to contribute to the economic sluggishness, but I think also contribute to an inability of the party to be able to be as effective as it wishes over the society. Third, obviously, a big thing we're all going to be watching is the elections next month in Taiwan. It's a very, very close race. It's not, I don't think it's yet clear, although it was several months ago, the thought would be that it would be a return of a continuation of the Democratic, the DPP party, the Democratic Progressive Party. But now it's not as clear. And it's a really neck-and-neck horse race now between the candidate for the DPP and the candidate for the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, the KMT. And I don't think we can predict yet with real certainty about who's going to come out on top. The polls show a very, very tight race between those two. And obviously, the outcome of that is going to have an enormous impact on how China is going to be viewing the situation across the Taiwan Strait. They are probably, in Beijing, somewhat more relieved to see that the KMT has gained some ground in this election cycle. I think they would have been very unhappy to have seen a continuation of the DPP, particularly as the lead candidate of the DPP is, at least in his past, was known to be a vocal advocate of, if not the status quo, continuing across the Taiwan Strait, even a more, somewhat more independent-leaning set of views. So we have to watch that, because if the KMT does come out victorious, then I think that's likely to contribute to a great deal more stability and at least some certainty for the next 3 to 4 years across the Taiwan Strait. If not, and the DPP does remain in the presidential palace, then I think we should expect China to continue to ratchet up the threats and the coercion and the military activities. I wouldn't expect that we'll see an invasion or a dramatic, kinetic military action against Taiwan in 2024. But I think we would, if the DPP were to continue, we should expect to see a slow and continuing ratcheting up of military activity, disinformation activity, continuing to try and diminish Taiwan's international presence, all as a way of trying to coerce or deter Taiwan away from any ideas of long-term de facto separation or independence from the mainland, and putting more pressure upon Taiwan to get them to come to the table to negotiate on Beijing's terms. And then finally, another area that I think we should be watching carefully, in a part, I think, almost in reaction or as a means of counterbalancing some of these other more difficult headwinds and challenges that Xi Jinping has and the party leadership has faced over the past several years, is a far more proactive engagement of the global South. Now that's been happening for some years now, but I think Beijing has come to the realization that there's enormous opportunity for it in the global South, for markets, for political partnerships, and to sort of put forward its own vision of how the international system should work. So I suspect we're going to be hearing a lot more in 2024 about the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative, all of which are sort of narrative frameworks that China is trying to promote in the international system, so that that system can slowly evolve into one that's going to be more favorable, more in line with China's own national interests and preferences. One big event in this respect is going to be the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which I think is going to be in May in Beijing this year. Also, the new expanded BRICS organization. At the last meeting of the organization, they're going to have to call it something else now, because it once stood for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. But now, with the addition of Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, that's going to make for one massive acronym. I leave it up to somebody much more clever than me to come up with it.
My suggestion was just to call it acronym.
Acronym, yeah.
So that it's flexible.
We'll know what it is.
Yeah.
These are just two interesting examples that we'll see China really devoting far greater political and economic, diplomatic resources to cultivating, courting, and expanding its presence within the Global South in 2024.
Paula, I burdened you with the overview at the start, which you expertly delivered. But of course, I want you to return to your specific expertise on Japan, because that's the other sort of major economy that'll have a big bearing on how things pan out. What are you expecting? Take a few minutes to tell us what you're expecting in Japan specifically.
Yeah, great, Bobby. Well, Japan is a very interesting economy. Japan has kind of, people talk about the lost decades. I don't think there were really lost decades in the sense in which that term conjures up. But Japan definitely in the last 10, 20, 15 years has drifted off the radar screen. I mean, it is still, depending on how you measure these things, the third or the fourth, slipping maybe into the fourth or the fifth largest economy in the world, and within Asia, obviously the second largest behind China. Two ways to measure these things: purchasing power parity, which kind of measures sort of how far a dollar goes, in different countries. You can think of it that way, and just the nominal exchange rate valuation of economies. But it's still a very, very large economy. And of course, as an economist, Japan has been endlessly fascinating for the last 20 years or so, again, tracking that lost decades kind of terminology because of its macroeconomic performance and its monetary policy, in particular, monetary policy innovations. Talked before about the inflation shock that hit the world that got all of these major central banks off the zero bound or the effective lower bound. That is, central banks, when the economy is starting to weaken or inflation is starting to dip below their target, they will cut interest rates. Well, they cut interest rates down to zero. We found out in the last few years that central banks can also engineer slightly negative interest rates, including the Bank of Japan. But pretty much that's the limit. So for the Fed, for the ECB, for the Bank of England, for the Reserve Bank of Australia, for all of these major central banks, the inflation shock allowed them to raise interest rates and get off the effective lower bound. But we're still waiting for that to happen in Japan. Inflation has been pushed up with this global inflation shock, but not to 7 or 8%, but to more around about 3%. And normally you might say, well, wouldn't that be enough to get the Bank of Japan hiking interest rates? Well, no, because since 2016, they've had a particular monetary policy framework in place called, talk about acronyms, QQE with YCC. That is quantitative and qualitative easing with yield curve control. And I mean, this is an extraordinary framework because what the Bank of Japan did under Governor Kuroda in 2016 in kind of two stages was first of all cut the policy rate, the overnight rate, to minus 10 basis points. So they sort of got on this negative interest rate train that had left the station with the ECB and some of the other European central banks the year before or even a little bit earlier. But then they adopted a policy that no other central bank yet, well, other than the Reserve Bank of Australia, actually, but they did it at the sort of the shorter end of the yield curve. But at the 10-year kind of reference rate, JGB rate, of pegging the interest rate around zero. And so you've got the yield curve in Japan, officially at least, from minus 10 basis points overnight to around about zero at the 10-year end of the curve. However, things are always a little bit more complicated in Japan, and what the Bank of Japan has done has let the actual long-term interest rate, the 10-year JGB rate, move up to 1%. So you have a 10-year JGB yield where they've said, we're targeting zero, but we're kind of prepared to see it move up as far as 1%, but still very, very low interest rates. And so now when people are looking at the Japanese economy for 2024 and beyond, the big question is, will the Bank of Japan be able to finally kind of release the economy from this extraordinary QQE with YCC policy? And the criterion that the Bank of Japan itself has kind of announced to the markets, and they did this in 2016, or around about that time, maybe a little bit later, was to say that they need to be convinced not that inflation is above 2%, which is their formal target now, but that it is expected to remain above 2%, and therefore would be able to withstand this monetary policy tightening. And at the moment, they have not yet made that judgment. They have a policy meeting later this month. There'll be a lot of interest in whether they signal that they think they're getting closer to that. But at the moment, they're still forecasting 2025 that inflation will dip below 2%. So as long as they're saying that, they're really signaling to the markets they're not ready yet to move away from this framework. Now, one of the implications of the Bank of Japan not yet being able to declare victory on its inflation targeting, of getting inflation back to 2%, while the Fed and the ECB and the Bank of England and the Reserve Bank of Australia and everybody else, not the Bank of China, People's Bank of China, they've gone the other direction. They're a little bit out of sync as well. But one of the consequences of this has been that the yen has weakened dramatically, even pushed through 150 yen to the dollar at one point. It's come back a little bit now, maybe 148 or so to the dollar. Now, I can remember the yen going to not just 80, but even for a couple of days below 80, way back in 1995, if my memory serves me correctly. So, for years and years in Japan, there was the talk of the strong yen. Now the yen has really weakened under this prolonged monetary policy easing. Now, that should be a very supportive factor for the Bank of Japan to be able to eventually declare victory and start to raise interest rates. But they haven't got there yet. So 2024, I think from an economic outlook point of view, it looks pretty good in Japan. It's sort of well hedged in a way. Either this very weak yen and this still very supportive monetary policy, and also some fiscal support coming through. Prime Minister Kishida has done something a little bit unusual, which is usually when things are looking a little bit better in Japan, they start to tap on the fiscal brakes. They say, well, now we can sort of start to worry about kind of fiscal sustainability issues. The narrative this time in Japan is a little bit different, and I actually support this, which is to say, with this rise in inflation, obviously people now on fixed incomes are seeing their incomes compressed and restrained. And so that's actually a kind of restraining force on the economy. If inflation goes up, but your wages don't go up yet, you're going to see real income declines, and that's actually bad for consumption. That's bad for an economic recovery. So on the fiscal side, they're actually providing some support to households, tax cuts, some income transfers, which all other things equal, is stimulatory for the economy. So you might say, if inflation's at 3%, why is the government putting more fiscal stimulus into the economy? Well, the answer is because Japan is still trying to get the economy out of this 25-year mildly deflationary situation. And so a little bit of extra fiscal stimulus now, hopefully, will help to nail the inflation staying above 2%, or around about 2% at least, and allow the Bank of Japan to move away from this very, at the moment, idiosyncratic kind of monetary policy framework and start to become more like a normal central bank. How important would that be? How significant would that be? Well, that would be a complete game changer in Japan. You've had a whole generation of people who have been watching Japanese economy that have never known anything other than zero interest rates in terms of policy rates and mild deflation. So this is a golden opportunity in the next year or so for Japan to be the one central bank that actually welcomes the inflation shock and to actually start to normalize the economy. Is it going to happen? I've been around too long and seen too many false dawns to get too excited. Part of the problem is that when you have a prolonged period of mild deflation, that deflationary mindset, what is this deflationary mindset? The general public, the Japanese population, sort of expecting inflation to run around zero or slightly minus, and therefore companies paying wages on that basis. And so it sort of becomes a self-fulfilling, self-reinforcing policy. So to get out of it, you will need a complete kind of mindset shift in the economy. If it happens, you could start to see things change in Japan, in quite a dramatic fashion. all the gears of the economy start to work in a different way. So 2024, obviously a lot of interest in China, the headwinds that Bates talked about, but the other big economy in Asia, Japan, I think is also one to keep a very close look on.
Now, when we were discussing earlier about my questions, I said that I would ask you to try and imagine, each of you to try and imagine a black swan event. But of course, as you pointed out, the moment you imagine it, it's no longer a black swan event. So let me throw something into the mix. Not a black swan event, but something that will have a major bearing, something that happens here that will have a major bearing everywhere at the end of next year when there's an election in this country. And let's say Donald Trump wins the election and comes back as president. What would that mean for the countries that you cover and pay closest attention to? Bates, I'll start with you because the China will be watching this election perhaps more closely.
That's definitely the other big election that the folks in Beijing will be watching very, very carefully. You get this question a lot from people. Which candidate do you think Beijing prefers? And my answer has always been Donald Trump. And people scratch their head and say, how could that be? Well, my reasoning is that to the degree, if he becomes president, he makes good on some of his campaign pledges of withdrawing support for allies, seeing to the completion of his original goal, at least stated goal, of dismantling NATO, or at least extracting the United States from NATO, which would in effect dismantle it, to continue to sow different forms of discontent and discord within the United States, to continue along the pathway of dysfunction politically here in the United States. I think all of that would be most welcome in Beijing. It could also mean, for example, less support for Ukraine, which is another one of President Trump's campaign promises. That too would be, I would think, music to the ears of the leaders in China. So I think they're watching it carefully. And while a Trump presidency would also have certain would raise certain new problems for China. I mean, there would probably be an even tougher approach to trade and investment than is already in place from the previous Trump administration and being continued under Biden. So there would certainly be downsides to a Trump presidency for China, but I think from an overall strategic perspective, the degree to which Beijing believes it would weaken the United States in its ability to pose a threat to China, that's a good thing.
Sydney, in Southeast Asia, how would
I agree wholeheartedly. I think that China would be the big winner in Southeast Asia, that this would convince most Southeast Asian governments that China was by far the most or the more reliable partner of the two. I think that it would put the total nail in the coffin of any association of the United States with democratic and human rights values, although that's already pretty much gone. I think that that there would be happiness in the junta in Myanmar. I think there would be real sadness and disillusionment among the pro-democracy forces in Thailand, which we haven't mentioned, which are unexpectedly, I would say, in the ascendant in the political scene in Thailand. In the Philippines, I don't know what would happen, but I think I would be more worried about a possible open clash in the South China Sea than I would if it were anybody else but Trump.
Indonesia?
Indonesia can live with anybody, but it would certainly put Indonesia more closely in the Chinese orbit than it is now.
Paul, how about Japan?
I don't think, I think Japan, can deal with a Republican administration, a Democratic administration, or a Trump administration. In fact, somewhat ironically, although circumstances have changed fairly dramatically since 2016, to many people's surprise, late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe developed a very early and very sort of cordial buddy relationship with President Trump, which I think many people saw as quite kind of deft political leadership by Prime Minister Abe and a good sort of diplomatic move. Why not try to have good relations with the president of your major ally? And of course, Japan operates under the security umbrella of the US. But I mean, moving away from the person of Donald Trump and president, which kind of can excite emotions and whatnot. As an economist looking at the last 10 years or so, or maybe not quite 10 years yet, but trying to make sense of how did Donald Trump get elected on the agenda that he put out. And of course, first of all, he had to beat 16 or 17 other pretty formidable Republican candidates, and then he had to win the 2016 election, and then of course lost the 2020 election. But the way I've been processing this for a number of years now is that, is to say that we had this period in the world of Pax Americana, where, after the Second World War, the US was the dominant, largest economy at one point, probably 50% of global GDP, and was sort of the benign hegemon to the world, if you like, or some people would say the global policeman, was the consumer of last resort, opened its markets, allowed Japan, Germany, Europe to rise from post-war destruction and really become well-developed economies. But of course, a lot changed over that period, and China joins the WTO in 2001, I guess it was. Experiences, prior to joining the WTO, and then subsequent to that, a 40-year period of close to 9-10% average growth. So a lot changed in the world. And again, if we look at it on a PPP basis, purchasing power parity, China overtook the US as the largest economy in the world around 2014, 2015. Nominal GDP, exchange rate basis, it still sort of lags. So we have a situation now in the world where two huge, formidable economies, but the US, I think the message from Make America Great Again, America First, was to say, look, we, America, can no longer perform this role, willing or able to do so. Now, that's changed, I think, in the last few years, and the sort of the geopolitical or the political consensus has shifted back more towards, no, the US can and should play this dominant role. But if you look at the messaging that comes out of China, it's, I think, a messaging based of dissatisfaction with that paradigm. And Bates mentioned the BRICS, which is surprisingly now going to add 5 or 6 countries. We'll have to see whether under the new president, Argentina does join BRICS.
Well,
or
they say they don't want to go.
We'll kind of see how that plays out.
Yeah.
But there seems to be a major, the global south is a new word that's sort of coming into play a lot, but a major kind of geopolitical kind of realignment going on in the world. And so, my big question, maybe it's 2025, 2026 rather than 2024, but how is all of this going to play out? We haven't really talked about the Taiwan Straits issue in Taiwan, etc. But it seems to me that the world geopolitically, not economically so much, but geopolitically, is in very kind of fractious waters and hasn't reached a new kind of geopolitical equilibrium, at least one that's satisfactory to the major players in the world. So how does that play out? Forget about Trump himself. But clearly there was a significant expression within the US political system that significant parts of this country's population do not want the US to continue to play the kind of role that it has in the past. How does that play out politically? I don't know, but it's still an unanswered kind of question.
You wanted to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to remind people that it was under Trump where we had a rise in Islamophobia and in anti-Asian violence. And most people in Indonesia and in Malaysia and in other Muslim communities especially, but also in Asian communities more generally, associate the Trump presidency with that kind of rise in hate crimes. And I think that's another reason why there would be real unhappiness with the return to power of Trump.
So, as promised, I'm going to ask each of you to pick one of the others and ask a question. I'm going to apply to you the same rules that I'm going to apply to the audience, which is keep your questions brief, and your answers as well. So, Sydney, why don't you go first?
Okay, well, I'll turn to you.
Okay.
I've been very interested in the reaction to the Belt and Road Initiative projects, and there's been a lot of complaints about everything from corruption to lack of maintenance to lack of community involvement and so on. At the last BRI summit, the Chinese promised to make their projects green, clean, and open, or clean, green, and open. Do you think there's any chance of that actually happening?
Well, I think they've taken on board, and this predates the most recent Belt and Road Forum. Say 3 or 4 years ago, I think it was becoming increasingly clear to the proponents of BRI that it wasn't doing what it was supposed to be doing. That it was getting a lot of pushback and blowback, and creating unsustainable debt burdens in many instances within the target countries. And so I think since that time, there's been an effort underway to try to rebrand, reshape, kind of have a BRI 2.0, if you will. But it's not only a reflection of those sort of difficulties and problems and challenges. I think it's also a reflection of where the Chinese leadership wants the Chinese economy itself to go, because the BRI was always a sort of a reflection of the Chinese economy, right? It was an effort to export over capacity. It was an effort to develop markets within the global South through what China could do very well, which was build stuff really fast and halfway decently. Now I think as the Chinese leadership is looking to change that model itself within China, right? Because they want to move over to a more consumer-led, a more green economy. That's at least the vision that's been stated. I think so too. Then BRI will begin to reflect that element again to be able to support China's own transition to a greener economy itself. So I think it's possible to happen. I think both for the political reasons, because they know that the old model has run up against so many challenges and difficulties, but also for economic reasons. It makes sense for them to try to become the market of choice, the driving innovator on green technology, just to take one example, and have massive opportunities and markets to do that in places like Africa and in Asia. So I think the short answer is yes, I think they can, okay. And we should follow it closely. I think there's every chance that they could be successful at it.
Thank you.
Bates, you get to ask next.
Oh, okay. Well, let's see. I had 2 questions in mind because I didn't know who I was going to end up posing the question to. But let me turn it to Paul. You mentioned Prime Minister Kishida. I was reading recently that he is the least popular prime minister of any post-war prime minister in Japanese history.
That's saying something. That really is saying something.
Something down in the range of the mid-20s of approval rating, right? I mean, obviously Kishida's no Abe, and maybe he never was going to be. But I just wonder if you could turn your sights a little bit on the political dynamics in Japan right now in 2024. I mean, is he out the door soon? Are we going to see a return to a more Abe type of leadership, or is that just not going to be possible the way the the way the party is organized.
Oh wow! I'm just a humble economist, so now I have to look into my political crystal ball here. But I would be surprised, Bates, if he's the most unpopular prime minister. I certainly remember, prime ministers like Prime Minister Mori, for example, early 2000s. I think he got down to like 15% or something like that. But there's a sort of there's a couple of kind of perennials about Japanese politics. I mean, one is that prime ministers typically start off with an approval rating, honeymoon period, maybe it's 50, 60%, and it just seems to be this inexorable decline. And I think Prime Minister Kishida is sort of experiencing some of that. The second kind of not quite perennial is that, Japanese prime ministers and politicians, like everywhere, I guess, tend to be products of their system. And Japan typically doesn't produce charismatic, kind of strong political leaders. There are the exceptions that prove the rule. Starting more recently, Abe Mark II, but not Abe Mark I, was a very formidable, kind of somewhat charismatic, somewhat decisive prime minister. But even there, you might also make the argument that he was, to a large extent, just got a lot cleverer about his political marketing and how he used the bureaucracy to good effect. If you go back further than that, you have obviously Koizumi. There's a few prime ministers in between, which have largely been forgotten. But Koizumi, Junichiro Koizumi, was again kind of charismatic and seemed to have a strong political message. Go back before that, I would put Ryutaro Hashimoto in that bucket. He did a lot of reform in the mid-1990s. Go back to the 80s, you had Nakasone. But so you can see these prime ministers that every now and again crop up that do seem to excite people more, and they're the ones that tend to keep their popularity higher. So it seems that there's a mismatch between sort of demand and supply. The Japanese population, I think, tend to reward, the Japanese electorate will reward kind of the stronger, more charismatic politicians, but unfortunately the supply of them is rather limited. So, how long is Prime Minister Kishida going to last? He came in, his big thing when he came in, and every prime minister comes in with a new sort of theme or a kind of a banner, if you like, banner policy. It was this new Japanese capitalism. And unfortunately, many people, myself included, looked at that and said, there's not very much new here. And that sort of faded a little bit. Now he's kind of, it's more how to handle this inflation situation. And as I said, he's tacking away from the normal kind of, listen to the Ministry of Finance, fiscal hawks, and tap on the fiscal brakes kind of thing, and doing something a little bit different. So I think whether he succeeds, whether he can last a little bit longer than 1 or 2 years is going to depend very much on what happens next year in terms of, does inflation come down? I think it will come down. And does that give the Bank of Japan the wherewithal to start to normalize monetary policy? I don't think Prime Minister Kishida could claim a lot of credit for that, but he would be the Prime Minister in the seat when Japan started to experience this different kind of atmosphere. And some of you might be wondering, like, what's all this stuff with inflation and deflation? When you have chronic deflation, one of the consequences of that is that all of the nominal variables that people feel in the economy are rather stagnant. So the whole sort of atmospheric is downbeat and pessimistic. Let me just give you a number, which is, to me, quite shocking. If you look at the last 30 years in Japan, real GDP in cumulative terms is up about 24%. Nominal, in the US, it's up about 106%. So real GDP doubled in the US, and it only increased about a quarter of that in Japan. And that's the way that economists normally look at things in real terms. But if you look at nominal variables, nominal GDP in Japan in that period is up 15%. In the US, it's up 288%. So all of the nominal variables, the stock market, in particular, residential house prices, your wage packet, how much money you're bringing home, all of those things have gone up and up and up in the US. In Japan, they've stagnated. So I think that's the one hope for Prime Minister Kishida. Who could follow him? There are a few names out there, but I don't think anyone that's really kind of particularly compelling. Personally speaking, I kind of think a little bit of political stability for a while would be good. I fear that Japan does get back into this, each prime minister has 1 year, maybe 1.5 years, and that means every cabinet minister changes, and you just get this feeling that there's no real sort of political leadership at the top.
So you get to ask.
Oh, my question now interested you mentioned that the third plenum, I hadn't quite realized the significance of the fact that that hasn't taken place yet. And you mentioned 2 to 3% potential growth in China, which for my liking would be, far too low, because China is still, in per capita GDP terms, whether you measure it nominal terms or purchasing power parity, is, way behind the US. And nominal basis about 1/6 of the US. PPP or adjusted basis still about 1/3 of the US. So it would seem to me that China needs to grow, somewhat faster. Maybe put policies in place where it can grow 4 or 5%. But what do you make, Bates, of the sort of economic policy debate to the extent that you can divine it in China? Do you get the sense that there is a strong reform camp around Xi Jinping, at least voices that are sort of saying, look, here's the reform agenda that you're going to need to really make sure that China stays on this economic development path and doesn't just slip into the middle income trap?
Right. Well, I'm just a humble international relations person. I don't follow the economy very, very much. But I think the short answer to your question is it does not appear that there is a group that is vocal enough or strong enough to have Xi take some of the more traditional reform measures that are obviously needed. So what's the evidence of that? Well, we continue to hear Xi place emphasis on the importance of security and political stability over economic growth. We can, because this is a very, it's a very opaque system, so it's hard to know exactly what those conversations are. But the new leadership that was brought in to power, what was that, last year, about a year ago, they I think were widely seen as primarily political types and ideological types rather than being sort of hard-headed economic technocrats. People like Liu He, who's now stepped down, but apparently may still have some influence. But it's just a question of whether he's able to, how much influence can he really have? The policies that she speaks about of trying to redistribute income to try and tamp down the successes really of business persons, especially the super wealthy. All of this, I think, is putting a damper on what many would hope would be a little bit more reform oriented. And and a lot of these challenges aren't entirely the fault of Beijing. I mean, they're also going to be they're obviously going into a future in which their access to markets, especially in the global West or the global North, whatever you want to call it, the developed world, are going to be more difficult. Inputs into the Chinese economy from the developed world, whether that's in technology or capital, know-how, and so on, those are going to be increasingly squeezed going forward. At least it looks that way. Maybe even more so should a Trump presidency return. So you add all this up together, and I think you see that there's a lot of problems, and but there's an underlying reluctance to go back to the sort of the Deng Xiaoping pragmatism of sort of a Western-style reform model. I think that seems to be off the table because, well, it just seems that Xi Jinping does not see that as the proper way of maintaining the party in place. So I think the short answer is no. There is not going to be significant reform measures a la Deng Xiaoping put in place under Xi Jinping.
Okay. So now we're going to turn over the mic to you to ask questions. Please raise your hands, and there's a mic at the back that will come around to you. identify yourself when you ask your question. Please do keep it brief so that we can get as many questions in as possible. Show of hands. Go ahead. Just wait till you get the mic.
Sure. Jeff Christensen, thank you for the panel. Question about comparative military strength. How would you assess the current sort of military strength in terms of between China and the United States, Navy, Army, Air Force, et cetera?
Wait, you want to take that?
Sure. It's an important question because obviously this is keeping, the answer to that question is keeping planners awake at night in Beijing and in the big five-sided building down in Northern Virginia. And I think it's a mixed picture. On the one hand, under certain scenarios, especially close in, and let's just take the Taiwan Strait as an example, close into Chinese shores, they can deliver an enormous amount of firepower and do it from their own shores against an adversary that is having to rely on very extended supply chains and logistics chains, without the benefit of a mainland sort of home from which you can launch your own counterattacks. So I think the advantages are growing for China for sure. And over the past 10 or 15 years, they've made huge strides in certain areas of technology like ballistic missiles and land-based cruise missiles. You mentioned the Navy. You're probably all aware that in terms of number of ships, the Chinese Navy is larger than the U.S. Navy. It's not larger in terms of tonnage, but it has more vessels than the U.S. Navy does, and that gap's just going to continue to widen because there's a massive shipbuilding program going on, military shipbuilding program going on in China. Not so really in the United States, at least not comparably. So I would say that the relative balance is moving in a direction that favors China. China's catching up, and maybe that's a way of putting it. And it's particularly true in certain quite specific scenarios, like I said, that would be close in, where China can get the greatest advantage of being able to have its own home base, its own mainland, and its own ability to resupply itself relatively quickly compared to the challenges that the United States would face. All that said, I always like to remind folks that China has not fought a serious war against a determined adversary in 40 years. Since the early 1980s against Vietnam, right? So we all know that once the real firing and shooting starts, anything can happen. And this is not a military that has ever had that experience, and is not yet proven itself capable of fighting under those circumstances a modern joint style warfare against a very, very powerful adversary or adversaries. If we were to take the Taiwan scenario, presumably the Taiwan military is going to be a part of that. Presumably Japan would be a part of that in some way. So I think the advantages that America enjoyed militarily vis-a-vis China have eroded with time and will continue to erode. But China still has a lot of problems within its military. So I suppose the United States, comparably speaking, probably still retains significant advantage.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Tim. Curious to get the panel's thoughts on the economic decoupling between China and the U.S. and parts of the West. Like, will that continue? Is it realistic? And how might that create opportunities for other parts of Asia, like Southeast Asia or Japan?
Paul, you want to take?
We've been hearing about decoupling, for a couple of decades now. It's not a new term, and it's easier said than done. And I think this time the decoupling, because it has much more of a national security, geopolitical kind of flavor to it, chip wars and supply chain diversification and resilience, etc. It's probably got a little bit more tailwind than it had before, but I think the decoupling, I would say the decoupling between China and the U.S. is going to be limited. Simply because of a couple of things. One is the size of the two economies and the fact that they are already so interlinked. I, as an economist, I have a kind of habit of, I did this today actually, was whenever I go into any shop or department store or whatever, I lift up the product and I see where is it made. Made in China, and of course I look at the data as well. But there has been some leveling off in terms of, for example, U.S. imports from China and China exports to the U.S. So it's not like rocketing up like it used to be, but it's still at a very, very high level. So it's very difficult to kind of unscramble that egg. And I think if you listen to the rhetoric on both sides, if you listen to the U.S. rhetoric, as I kind of interpret it, or the messaging is, we don't want to decouple from China. We still want to trade with China, but we do want to protect our intellectual property, and we want to make sure that we have guardrails around national security issues. So we're going to partially decouple, or maybe decouple or diversify in very kind of select areas. And I think on the Chinese side as well, the U.S. is still the biggest market for China, so they're not in any great hurry to decouple from their point of view. Having said that, of course, comparative advantage is changing as well, and production will shift out of China for reasons that may have to do with shifting labor costs and comparative advantage as much as some policy-driven decoupling. But I would say decoupling to a certain extent, but quite limited.
Is there excitement in Southeast Asia, Sydney, about this talk of decoupling and the opportunities that might present for Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand?
Definitely Vietnam, I would say. It's not clear how advantages are going to be greater than they are now. I think one of the very interesting sectors is not manufacturing so much as mining, where the Chinese are increasingly involved in not only mining of nickel for lithium batteries and gold mining, but also in the provision of smelters and what they call downstream infrastructure, which the U.S. is just not present in.
Question over here.
Hi, Avi Samudrella. I had a follow-up question to the military question for the panel. What countries in Southeast Asia do you feel would be most likely to spend on military and expand their military budgets at the behest of the United States and as a defensive mechanism for an expanding China? And what is the appetite for that expenditure?
Sydney?
Well, I think that it's clear that both the Philippines and Indonesia would like to expand their military budgets, but there is a determination throughout the ASEAN countries, with the possible exception of the Philippines, not to get drawn into U.S.-China tensions and not to use this as an excuse for siding with one or the other. But certainly there's been an effort to vastly increase the military budget in Indonesia, an acknowledgement that a lot of their equipment is outdated and so on. There is also, however, a desire to get American or European equipment rather than Chinese, because Chinese arms are seen as relatively shoddy compared to what's available from the U.S., and that's an ongoing factor in the equation.
Hi, thank you so much for the amazing talk. I'm just curious.
Please identify yourself.
Yes, Wei Junhu here. Thank you so much for the talk. We touched a lot about Japan, China, US, but there's an upcoming election in 2024 in India as well, and I think we didn't touch much on South Asia. The neighboring Pakistan is also undergoing some troubling times, so I would appreciate if you have some insights from the South Asia region. Especially, it seems like the West is increasingly engaged with India to counter China, but some recent development in Canada, even here in New York City, might have also some headwinds for that. And I would appreciate your insights on that issues as well. Thank you.
Who wants to start? Bates, does China have a preference in India?
Well, I don't follow that relationship all that closely, to be honest, but I think there must be a recognition in Beijing that their diplomacy, their effort to court or cultivate India has not worked out very well. I mean, obviously, they're still, growing trade partners. I think they still share or try to share or trumpet a sort of solidarity when it comes to issues of importance to the global South. India is obviously a founding member of the BRICS organization. I believe India has also signed up to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as well. So, there's I think an effort at one level between these two giants to appear cordial to one another and to try to gain advantage as best they can, mutual advantage through their relationship. But obviously, underlying all of this, is what I understand to be a deep distrust, certainly in India, about China, toward China. There's the effort underway to try and establish some greater diplomatic and political, in some lesser extent, military ties between India and the United States and other leading allies of the United States, like Australia, as a counterbalance to this distrust, a way of mitigating or trying to counterbalance what they see as a growing China potential threat to India. And we can't forget, it was just only a few years ago that there was the bloody and fatal clashes on the Sino-Indian border. So that has not gone away. So I guess it all adds up in my mind. I would expect that we would see, regardless of who the next leader of India might be, I would expect that we should see a continuing effort by India to try to diversify its relationships, and in particular to strengthen ties with the global West.
I was going to ask you, India's made a concerted effort in Southeast Asia to sort of develop some military ties. Is India seen realistically as a kind of...
India is seen as a persecutor of Muslims.
There's that.
And that's the major image that India has in Indonesia and in Malaysia. And there's very little that is going to change that until an alternative to Hindu nationalism comes along.
Yeah, so I'll answer as an economist and stay out of hot water, hopefully. But India, and thank you for raising India, because, it's the third largest economy in the world measured by the way that economists measure these things, purchasing power parity. So that's China, that's the US, and then there's a bit of a gap to third as India, and then Japan, and maybe Russia, Germany, economies like that. And it's kind of similar to China in one respect, of course, that it has got a very large population, probably whatever it is, 1.4 billion people or so. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's about to
now the largest. It's already overtaken.
It's got a relatively low per capita GDP, which means it has a lot of potential growth ahead of it. It's an economy like China that managed to kind of crack the economic development code, at least to a degree, and get on that economic development path. But if it can stay on that path, it's got a long way to go. It's got a very, very long runway. So, this is not 2024, but 10 years, 20 years in the future, it could be a very, very formidable. It might be the second largest economy in the world. Whatever. It's got the demographic side, the kind of tailwind rather than headwind, which China has now starting to experience. It's got an incredible diaspora. It's got English as a kind of whatever it is, second language or second official language. It's got demonstrated high degree of capability in the IT area, kind of to a certain extent missed the manufacturing stage of economic development. It's still there to a certain extent. So it's got a whole lot of positive factors. Bates mentioned sort of the more the geopolitical angle. Again, it's kind of interesting the way India seems to be able to hedge itself quite nicely. Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, but also a member of the Quad with the US, Japan, and Australia. And it's I think it's still a member in some shape or form of the Commonwealth. It's got cricket. That's got to be good. So it's a major potential growth pole in the global economy. And one thing, as somebody who's originally from Australia, that has just struck me the last few years, I didn't go back to Australia with COVID for obvious reasons. You couldn't get in or out of the country. But even like between 2019 and 2023, when my wife and I went this year a couple of times, visibly you can see the Indian presence in Australia, immigrants rising. But again, that creates a diaspora for India, which they maybe lose some people, but they gain the diaspora. So I think, I've always been a kind of closet bull on Italy. Yes, it's got this noisy democracy. It's got,
it's a democracy that's weakening almost daily.
Maybe, but it's got a kind of. I look at China and I see potential fragility because of the political system. India seems to be this noisy, chaotic, democratic, hopefully, kind of creature that has some inherent kind of, because of that, some inherent stability, perhaps resilience that maybe China potentially could lack. And the more I listen to Bates, the more I get a little bit more concerned about the longer term outlook in China.
I think we have time for one last question from the audience.
Hi, my name is Hari. Could you talk about the cooperation between Russia, Iran, and China as an alternative to cooperation with the United States in the world?
Well, maybe again, let me go first, but leave it to the geopolitical international relations experts. I mean, we didn't really talk about Russia tonight, but clearly, there is this changing geopolitical kind of landscape where Russia and China have got very complementary economies. Russia is very resource rich, oil, natural gas, other kinds of minerals, and is increasing. Trade with China is picking up, I think, 30% year on year, the latest number. And the world is, going back to this decoupling. I was kind of on the economic decoupling with China and the US, a little bit cautious about that. But there is this enlarged BRICS process going on, and some surprising countries are jumping on that train. How the carriages hang together is yet to be seen. But it is looking, and one of the features here, of course, we haven't talked at all about the international role of the US dollar and the reserve currency status. The US has made some moves in the last couple of years, obviously, with the Russian situation, that I will put my cards on the table as an economist, with the sanctions, with the freezing of Russia's foreign exchange reserves. I think very, very kind of questionable moves from an economic point of view. I can see the temptation to weaponize the US dollar for geopolitical reasons, but it's really tempting fate and putting the exorbitant privilege, as it's been called at risk. So one of the other things, perhaps in 2024, the BRICS summit was mentioned. Again, this is easier said than done, but the extent to which we start to see serious moves among those BRICS countries, which includes some countries that are on the receiving end of sanctions, or potentially might see themselves being on the receiving end of sanctions in the future, of trying to develop an alternative, international currency architecture, which gets them away from the dollar. Again, easier said than done, particularly if you trade with the US, you tend to accumulate claims on the US financial system. But I think those currency geopolitical dynamics are going to be very, very interesting to watch over the next year or two.
It's worth noting that Vladimir Putin took almost instant advantage of the coup in Myanmar to offer aid and arms when sanctions were applied and imposed by the West. So the junta in Myanmar now depends very heavily on Russian arms. Also, it's worth noting that in Indonesia, for reasons I'm still not certain about, but the population tends to be more pro-Russian on the Russian-Ukraine issue than it is pro-Ukraine. And it's been a source of frustration to the Ukrainian ambassador in Jakarta that no matter what the situation is with the conflict, most opinion polls still make the Indonesians more favoring the Russian side than the Ukrainian side. Also, the Russians have moved in fairly heavily in the mining sector in Indonesia. I don't know how much they're present in Thailand or Vietnam or some. Well, they've got a very strong presence in Vietnam. So I think over the last decade or so, they've certainly increased their economic activities in the region, and now are benefiting politically as well from the situation in Myanmar.
Last word to you, Bates.
Well, I think you've identified a trend that we're going to just see expanding and growing over the course of 2024 and beyond, and that is Beijing's effort to identify key sort of pivotal players in different parts of the world, especially in the global south, who may well share a common concern toward the United States, may even see the United States as an enemy, who share a common concern about the weaponization of the U.S. dollar and what that could mean for their economies going forward, and who also share a sort of preference for strong, authoritarian, non-democratic leadership models. And I think we're going to see a deepening, a growing exchange and interaction, maybe possibly culminating in some form of a internationalization of the renminbi, quite possibly, as difficult as that may be. What that really means for us when we look forward is a continued sort of fracturing, right, of the international system. Not decoupling exactly, but I think more movement towards a sort of two camps, maybe that's too strong of a word, that are characterized by advanced, largely democratic or democratically leaning economies on the one hand, sort of the global West, if you want to call it that, or global North, but on the other hand, less developed, less democratically oriented, emerging economies around the world that are largely located in what we're coming to call the global South. By the way, I include Russia in the global South, but that's not a geographic reason for that. But so I think you've identified an interesting issue that we should all be following, and I think it's going to continue. This is just one aspect of it, what you've identified, the China-Russia-Iran relationship. We'll be seeing a lot more of it. May I just make one small advertisement on the China-Russia question?
Please go ahead.
We've launched, the Center for China Analysis has launched a program on China-Russia relations. It's led by our very own Chief Programming Officer at the Asia Society, Philip Ivanov. We really want to look more closely at this because we believe that across all elements, economic, military obviously, but also I think increasingly in terms of ideology and politics, international ideology and politics, these two countries increasingly find reasons to be close with one another. And that's unlikely to change going forward, and we're trying to unpack it.
Great.
I want to thank all of you for sharing your wisdom and your insights here this evening. It's going to be one hell of a year with the big election here, as well as the developments that we expect to see in the region as you've described them. Bates, Sydney, Paul, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel.
Thank you, Bobby.
Good to see you.
Thanks, Bobby.